The carriage advanced along the cobblestone path as Abigail watched her gloved hands tremble slightly in her lap. It wasn't the chill of the March morning that made her shiver, but rather the certainty of what awaited her at the Ashford estate. More pitying glances, more discreet whispers behind painted fans, more young debutantes being presented to eligible gentlemen, while she, at 28, remained as invisible as the old furniture in the drawing rooms. "Smile, Abigail," Lady Margaret Hartley, her mother, commanded, without tearing her gaze from the passing landscape outside the window. "Charlotte deserves a joyful wedding, without your melancholy expression ruining the photographs." Abigail bit the inside of her cheek, savouring the physical pain that distracted her from the emotional wound. Charlotte, her younger sister by 6 years, was marrying Lord Edmund Ashford that day, heir to a considerable fortune and lands stretching across 3 counties. 2 years prior, Eleanor, her middle sister, had wed the Viscount of Pemberton in a ceremony that high society had spoken of for months. And Abigail remained unmarried, a silent shame that her mother carried like a thorn in her side. "Yes, Mamma," she replied, keeping her voice neutral, as she had learned to do over the years. The Ashford estate revealed itself to be majestic when the carriage crossed the wrought-iron gates. Perfectly manicured gardens lined the main avenue, where marble fountains gushed crystal-clear water. The mansion, built in Georgian style, stood imposingly with its white columns and dozens of windows reflecting the morning sun. Guests were already gathering in the great hall when the Hartley family arrived. Abigail recognized familiar faces from the London aristocracy: the Dukes of Somerset with their 3 marriageable daughters, the Earl of Winchester accompanied by his notoriously frivolous wife, Lady Beatrice Drummond, with her retinue of admirers, all dressed in the most exquisite fashion, the women in silk gowns with cinched waists and voluminous skirts, the men in impeccably tailored tailcoats. "Abigail, my dear," Lady Drummond's shrill voice cut through the chatter. "What a surprise to see you here. I thought you were caring for some orphan or teaching poor girls to read." The comment provoked muffled laughter around them. Abigail felt a blush creep up her neck, but maintained her composure. "Lady Drummond, always so thoughtful to remember my charitable activities. Indeed, I divide my time between St. Mary's Orphanage and the girls' school in Whitechapel." "What admirable dedication," Lady Drummond replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, though some consider such involvement with the lower classes rather improper for a lady of your standing. Before Abigail could reply, her mother discreetly pulled her by the elbow, drawing her away from the group. "Control yourself," Lady Margaret hissed. "Is it not enough that you are the only Hartley without a husband? Must you also attract attention with your eccentricities?" Abigail swallowed the bitter retort that burned on her tongue. Her eccentricities consisted of dedicating time and resources to help those in need, of reading voraciously about philosophy and science, of having her own opinions on politics and economics. Unpardonable sins for a woman of society. The ceremony took place in the estate's private chapel, decorated with white lilies and pearl-colored roses. Charlotte was radiant in her wedding gown, her Belgian lace veil falling gracefully over her blonde curls. Abigail watched her sister exchange vows with Lord Edmund, genuinely happy for her, even if a pang of envy squeezed her heart. Not for the pomp or the title, but for the promise of companionship, for the possibility of building a life alongside someone. The banquet that followed was sumptuous. Tables covered with Irish linen tablecloths displayed silver service and crystals that caught the light of the chandeliers. Roast partridges, fresh salmon, elaborate tarts and French pastries were served. Port wine and champagne flowed freely. Abigail found refuge in a corner of the ballroom, observing the guests. The gentlemen gathered in groups to discuss business and politics. The ladies gossiped and discussed matrimonial arrangements. Some couples were already dancing to the sound of the orchestra hired for the occasion. Such an elegant lady should not be alone at a celebration. The deep, unexpected voice made Abigail turn abruptly. The man before her was tall, with broad shoulders, accentuated by the perfect cut of his navy tailcoat. Wavy brown hair framed a face with striking features, and amber-colored eyes observed her with an intensity that unsettled her. "Sir, Daniel Whitmore," he introduced himself with an elegant bow. "And I presume you are Miss Abigail Hartley, the bride's sister." Abigail knew the name, as everyone in high society did. Daniel Whitmore, heir to one of England's largest fortunes, owner of coal mines and railways, related to the royal family through collateral lines. At 32, he remained unmarried despite the countless young debutantes thrown in his path each social season. "Correct, Mr. Whitmore. Though I am surprised you know my name." A smile touched his lips. "I made it a point to inform myself. They say you personally run an orphanage and a school, as well as holding rather progressive views on female education." Abigail stiffened, bracing herself for another veiled criticism. "I did not come here to reprimand you," and he continued, as if reading her thoughts. "On the contrary, I find your activities remarkable. Few members of our class have the courage or compassion to truly involve themselves with social issues." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "I would appreciate it if you did not mock me, sir." "I am being absolutely sincere." Daniel took a step closer, lowering his voice. "How long has it been since anyone paid you a genuine compliment?" "Miss Hartley?" The question, too intimate coming from a stranger, made her eyes sting. She blinked rapidly, refusing to show weakness. "Forgive me if I was indelicate," he said softly. "It was not my intention to cause you discomfort. Only, there is something in your expression, the way you observe everything around you with that mix of melancholy and determination. It is fascinating." "Fascinating," she repeated, the word sounding bitter. "A curious description for a 28-year-old spinster. I prefer the term woman of substance." Before Abigail could reply, Lady Margaret materialized beside them, her eyes gleaming with calculated interest as she recognized Daniel Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, what an honor to have you at our family celebration. I see you've met my eldest daughter." "Actually, Lady Hartley, I came specifically for that purpose." Daniel kept his gaze fixed on Abigail. "I would like to request the honor of a dance with Miss Hartley." The silence that followed was almost palpable. Around them, conversations ceased. Heads turned. The most coveted bachelor in London had just asked the spinster Hartley to dance, completely ignoring the young debutantes who watched him with expressions ranging from shocked to indignant. Abigail felt the weight of dozens of gazes upon her. Her first instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from the humiliation that would surely follow. But something in Daniel Whitmore's eyes stopped her. There was a promise there, a serene certainty that intrigued her. "It would be a pleasure," she heard herself say. He extended his gloved hand, and when Abigail's fingers touched his, a jolt of electricity shot up her arm. Daniel led her to the center of the ballroom as the orchestra began a waltz. Under the astonished gazes of the London aristocracy, they began to dance. Daniel Whitmore's hand was firm against her back as he guided Abigail through the steps of the waltz. She had not danced in so long that she feared she would stumble, but he led her with such skill that her feet seemed to recall the rhythm on their own. The ballroom spun around them in a whirlwind of colors and murmurs, but Abigail felt strangely isolated in that bubble of two. "Breathe," Daniel murmured, so low that only she heard. "Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you intimidated." Abigail raised her chin, meeting those amber eyes that observed her with something beyond mere courtesy. There was defiance there, but also an understanding that completely unnerved her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Surely there is no shortage of young ladies eager for your attention. Perhaps I am bored of young ladies, whose conversations do not extend beyond the weather and the latest Parisian trend." "And you presume I would be different?" "I know you are." Daniel led her through a graceful pirouette. "I read your article in The Guardian on the necessity of reforms in workhouses. Published under a pseudonym, naturally, but it was not difficult to uncover the authorship." Abigail's heart skipped a beat. She had been so careful, using the name A.J. Hartford to sign her occasional contributions. How had he found out? "I see I have surprised you," Daniel continued, a slight smile curving his lips. "I have a certain interest in social matters. When I found that brilliant argumentation on human dignity and the responsibility of the privileged, I was intrigued. A few discreet inquiries revealed the writer's true identity. And do you intend to expose me?" The question came out more fragile than Abigail intended. "I intend," he paused deliberately, his fingers lightly squeezing hers, "to invite you to dinner tomorrow evening." There is much I would like to discuss with someone who truly understands the urgency of these matters. The music came to an end before Abigail could reply. Daniel led her back to the edge of the ballroom, where Lady Margaret awaited with an expression that wavered between triumph and disbelief. "Miss Hartley," Daniel bowed formally, but his eyes held that glimmer of complicity. "I await your answer regarding dinner. I shall send a proper invitation through your mother, naturally." He withdrew before she could protest, leaving her under Lady Margaret's piercing gaze and the growing murmurs that spread through the ballroom like fire through dry straw. "What have you done?" hissed her mother, grabbing her arm tightly. "How did you manage to attract Daniel Whitmore's attention?" "I did absolutely nothing, Mama. Don't lie to me. He asked you to dinner. Daniel Whitmore, who refused invitations from the daughters of England's most influential dukes." Abigail felt a headache begin to throb in her temples. Around them she could feel the poisonous glances of the other ladies, hear the ill-disguised whispers. Lady Drummond watched with her lips pressed into a thin line, while the young debutantes gathered near the dessert table pierced her with expressions of pure incredulity. "I need air," Abigail murmured, freeing herself from her mother's grip and walking quickly towards the gardens. The night was surprisingly mild for March. Abigail followed a gravel path between dormant rose beds, moving away from the illuminated windows of the mansion. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her gloves, trying to process what had just happened. Daniel Whitmore, the man who had become a legend in London society, not only for his considerable fortune, but for his systematic refusal to conform to expectations. They said he had spent years traveling the continent, studying philosophy at German universities and engaging with French social reformers. When he returned to England after his father's death, he had taken over the family businesses, but with methods considered eccentric by the aristocracy. He had improved working conditions in his mines, invested in decent housing for his employees and funded schools. And now he had invited her to dinner. Fleeing your own sister's celebration? What a scandal! Abigail spun on her heels, finding Daniel leaning against a marble statue, his hands in his trousers pockets, in a decidedly informal stance. "Did you follow me, sir?" "Guilty." He approached, and Abigail realized she was alone with a gentleman in the gardens, a situation that would ruin her reputation if anyone discovered them. As if there were any reputation left to ruin, a bitter voice whispered in her mind. "This is highly improper, Mr. Whitmore." "I agree. However, given how society has already decided you are improper simply for having a mind of your own, I thought you might appreciate one more transgression." "You don't know me," Abigail retorted, feeling a wave of irritation replace her initial disconcertion. "You have no right to presume my opinions or my desires." "You are right." Daniel stopped a few paces away, and there was something in the way the moonlight illuminated his face that made Abigail's heart quicken uncomfortably. "But I would like to get to know you genuinely." "Why?" "As entertainment. A curiosity to alleviate your aristocratic boredom?" "Because—" He took another step forward, his voice low and intense. "In the last 5 years I have observed this society and its absurd conventions. I have observed brilliant young women being transformed into empty ornaments, taught to stifle any original thought. And then I heard about you, the spinster Hartley who refuses to pretend to be less than she is, who writes about social justice in newspapers, who works in orphanages when she should be taking tea with other ladies. I read your words before I saw your face, Miss Hartley, and I was fascinated by the mind that produced them." Abigail felt tears sting her eyes, furious with herself for the weakness. No one had ever spoken to her that way. No one had ever seen beyond the spinster, the disappointment, the troublesome daughter who couldn't secure a husband. "This isn't fair," she whispered. "What isn't fair?" "To appear at my sister's wedding and say such things, to make me—" She paused, unable to complete the sentence. "To make you feel hope?" Daniel finished softly. "To make you imagine that perhaps there is someone who sees you as you truly are?" "Stop." The word came out broken. "Please, stop." He drew back immediately, and Abigail saw something akin to regret cross his face. "Forgive me, I was hasty. Only, when I saw you there in the ballroom, alone amidst all that frivolity, it was like recognizing someone. As if finally there was someone else who saw the same fissures I see in this gilded, rotten world. Abigail discreetly wiped her eyes, composing herself. You speak very radically for a member of the aristocracy, and you write very radically for a lady of society. It seems we have that in common. An unexpected laugh escaped Abigail, surprising them both. It was absurd. This entire moment was utterly absurd. And yet there was a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years. I accept your invitation to dinner, she said abruptly, before she could reconsider. But under conditions that it would be a properly chaperoned encounter? Naturally, my mother would permit nothing less. Abigail raised her chin. And that you be honest with me about your intentions. I am not a naive young woman to be manipulated. My intentions, Daniel said slowly, are to get to know better the woman behind the words that fascinated me. As for the rest, he paused, his eyes fixed on hers, I believe we should discover that together. Voices echoed from the path, interrupting the moment. Daniel stepped back another pace, re-establishing the appropriate distance. Until tomorrow, Miss Hartley. He disappeared among the shadows of the garden moments before Eleanor appeared on the path, her light blue dress gleaming under the torchlight. Abigail, Mama is looking for you, and everyone is talking about... She paused, studying her sister's face. Are you all right? You look different. I am well, replied Abigail, surprising herself by realizing it was true. For the first time in a long time she was well, perhaps even better than well. As she followed Eleanor back to the mansion, Abigail looked back once at the gardens shrouded in shadows, where that impossible conversation had taken place. Something had changed that night. A door had opened, where before there had only been a wall. And although common sense told her to be cautious, to protect her heart already so bruised by rejection, a small flame of hope stubbornly flickered in her chest. Tomorrow. She would see him tomorrow, and perhaps she would begin to discover if that moment in the gardens had been real, or just another cruel fantasy destined to disappoint. The following morning arrived with a brightness that seemed excessive to Abigail's eyes. She had barely slept, mentally replaying every word exchanged with Daniel Whitmore in the Ashford estate gardens. In the light of day, in her familiar room at the Hartley residence in Mayfair, everything seemed less real, almost dreamlike. Perhaps she had imagined the intensity in his amber eyes, the sincerity in his voice when he spoke of admiring her work. "Miss, you have a visitor," announced Martha, her lady's companion, entering the room with an ill-disguised expression of curiosity. "Lady Margaret requested your immediate presence in the morning room." Abigail dressed with more care than usual, choosing a moss-green muslin gown with discreet embroidery on the bodice. Not that her appearance mattered, she argued with herself, but there was something in the anticipation of that morning that made her want to appear presentable. The morning room was flooded with light when she descended the stairs. Her mother awaited by the fireplace, her hands clasped in her lap, in a posture Abigail immediately recognized as calculating. Eleanor sat on the damask sofa, her eyes bright with curiosity, while Charlotte had remained at the Ashford estate with her new husband. Finally, Lady Margaret rose with a rustle of skirts. "We have much to discuss." "Good morning to you too, Mama." "Don't be impertinent. Daniel Whitmore sent correspondence this morning." She gestured to a letter on the mahogany side table, the superior quality paper marked with a red wax seal. "It confirms dinner for this evening and formally requests permission to court you." The words seemed to suck the air from the room. Abigail sank heavily into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly weak. "Court you," repeated Eleanor, leaning forward. "Abigail, what happened last night, besides the dance?" "Nothing happened. We spoke briefly in the gardens." Briefly enough for him to decide to make a declaration of serious intentions. Lady Margaret crossed the room, her eyes studying her daughter with an attention that made her feel like an insect under glass. "This is extraordinary, completely unprecedented. Do you have an explanation?" Abigail met her mother's gaze, seeing there a complex mixture of anticipated triumph and residual distrust. For years she had been the disappointment, the problematic daughter who tarnished the Hartley family's impeccable record. Now, suddenly, she had become valuable. "We share similar interests in social matters." "Social matters," Lady Margaret pronounced the words as if they were vaguely indecent. Yes, well, whatever your shared peculiarities may be, this represents an opportunity that cannot be squandered. Daniel Whitmore is one of England's most sought-after bachelors. I am aware of his social standing, Mama. Then you are also aware that this courtship must be conducted with the utmost propriety. None of your radical opinions during dinner. No discussions of politics or economics. Be charming, docile, and for heaven's sake, smile occasionally. Familiar irritation began to simmer in Abigail's chest. If Mr. Whitmore seeks a docile woman without opinions, I believe he has chosen the wrong person. Don't be foolish. Men may say they appreciate intelligent women, but what they truly desire is conformity. You will have other opportunities for your charitable projects after marriage, but first you must secure the proposal. Presuming rather quickly, don't you think? He has only requested permission to court. Eleanor intervened softly, ever the peacemaker between mother and sister. Abigail is right, Mama. We shouldn't rush things. But, she turned to her elder sister, there is also no harm in presenting your best self. Mr. Whitmore clearly sees something special in you. Her sister's words, gentle where her mother's were demanding, touched Abigail in an unexpected way. Eleanor had always been the more understanding of the two sisters, the only one who seemed genuinely concerned with her happiness rather than merely her social suitability. I will behave appropriately, Abigail conceded at last, but I will not pretend to be someone I am not. If Mr. Whitmore seeks my company, it must be with honesty on both sides. Lady Margaret seemed about to protest, but something in her daughter's expression stopped her. Instead, she adjusted her skirts with an exasperated sigh. Very well, but at least try not to scare him away with your ideas about the rights of working women within the first hour of dinner. The hours until evening dragged by with agonizing slowness. Abigail tried to occupy herself with correspondence for St. Mary's Orphanage, but her mind insisted on wandering. What kind of conversation did Daniel Whitmore expect? Had he truly read her articles, recognized her authorship through the pseudonym? The idea that someone with his position and influence not only knew her work, but admired it, seemed simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. When the clock struck 5, Martha began the elaborate preparations. Abigail was bathed in water scented with lavender oils, her brown hair brushed until it gleamed and styled into an elegant coiffure that allowed a few loose curls to frame her face. The chosen gown was midnight blue silk with silver lace details, décolleté enough to be elegant without being improper. "You look beautiful," declared Martha, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Abigail observed her reflection in the oval mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back. It wasn't that she felt transformed into a beauty comparable to her sister's, but there was something different in her eyes, a luminosity she hadn't seen in years. Hope, she realized with a tightening in her chest. That dangerous emotion she had sworn never to allow herself to feel again. Daniel Whitmore arrived promptly at 7 o'clock, his black carriage with gilded details stopping before the Hartley residence. Lady Margaret had insisted on accompanying them as chaperone, though Abigail noticed her mother's ill-disguised vexation at not being able to simply leave them alone and hasten the courting process. "Miss Hartley," Daniel descended from the carriage and offered his gloved hand, his eyes sweeping over her appearance with an appreciation that made the heat rise in Abigail's neck. "You look dazzling tonight. Mr. Whitmore, I thank you for the invitation." He wore a perfectly cut black tailcoat over a silver brocade waistcoat, his cravat tied with casual elegance. When their fingers touched, even through her gloves, Abigail felt again that jolt of electricity that had unsettled her at the ball. The carriage took them through Mayfair to Belgravia, stopping before an imposing residence in Eaton Square. Daniel's house proved surprising, not for the expected opulence, but for the feeling of being lived in. There were books strategically placed in various rooms, works of art that seemed chosen for personal taste rather than ostentation, and a library that made Abigail's eyes widen with desire. "I see you appreciate literature," Daniel commented, observing her reaction as they passed through the corridor lined with bookshelves. That would be a considerable understatement. Dinner was served in an intimate room overlooking the private gardens, the table set for 3 with fine china and crystals that caught the light of the chandeliers. Lady Margaret was strategically positioned far enough to allow private conversation, but close enough to maintain appearances. I must admit, Daniel began after the first course was served, a delicate consommé, that I considered several approaches for this evening. Superficial conversation about the weather and social events seemed insulting to your intelligence. I thank you for sparing me that torture, Abigail replied, feeling gradually more at ease. Though I must warn you that my mother has extensively instructed me to be charming and avoid any controversial topics. His eyes gleamed with humor. And do you intend to follow that advice? Absolutely not. Lady Margaret coughed discreetly from across the table, but Abigail ignored her. Daniel smiled openly, and she noticed how the expression transformed his face from merely attractive to genuinely captivating. Then allow me to be direct, Miss Hartley. I have read all of your articles that I could locate. Your proposals on educational reform are brilliant, particularly the argumentation on universal access regardless of class or gender. How did you discover my identity? I was extremely careful. Your choice of pseudonym was clever, but you shared specific experiences from St. Mary's Orphanage in one of your texts. It was not difficult to connect A.J. Hartford with Abigail Jane Hartley, a known patron of that institution. Abigail should have felt alarmed by the exposure, but instead found herself intrigued by the dedication he had shown in investigating her. And what do you think of a woman who writes about social policy in newspapers? Daniel leaned slightly forward, his expression serious. I think she is precisely the kind of person with whom I wish to spend my time, someone who sees beyond the gilded drawing rooms and recognizes the structural flaws of our society. The conversation flowed naturally from there. Moving between topics Abigail rarely could discuss with anyone, they debated conditions in factories, the need for labor regulation, the theories of European social reformers. Daniel proved surprisingly progressive in his views, speaking with passion about the social responsibility of the privileged. I inherited fortune and position, he said as the main course was served, a roast lamb with aromatic herbs. But I also inherited the moral obligation to use those resources for something beyond mere accumulation of wealth. My father vehemently disagreed. He thought my reforms in the mines a foolish extravagance. But you implemented them nonetheless. Yes, and I discovered that well-treated workers are more productive and loyal. Philanthropy also proved to be a sound business strategy, though that was not my primary objective. Abigail studied him through the flickering candlelight, searching for signs of falsehood or manipulation. But there was only sincerity on that face, a conviction that mirrored her own. Why me? She asked abruptly. There are dozens of young women who would accept you immediately, more beautiful, younger, without a reputation for eccentricity. Daniel placed his fork on his plate, dedicating his full attention to her. Beauty fades, Miss Hartley. Youth is temporary. But intelligence, compassion, the courage to stand by one's convictions even against the opposition of society, these qualities are eternal and extraordinarily rare. The words hit Abigail with physical force, momentarily stealing her breath. No one had ever seen her that way, as something valuable instead of flawed. Furthermore, he continued with a half-smile, I think it would be immensely tedious to marry someone whose only concern was choosing the appropriate gown for each occasion. Marry! The word escaped before Abigail could contain it. Eventually, I hope. If you allow me to court you properly, and we discover we are as compatible as I believe. This time Lady Margaret could not disguise her satisfied sigh from across the table. The week following dinner unfolded into a succession of carefully orchestrated meetings under the vigilant eye of London society. Daniel Whitmore proved to be an attentive and surprisingly patient suitor, respecting social conventions, while finding subtle ways to reveal more about himself during each chaperoned visit. Abigail found herself anticipating his appearances with a disconcerting eagerness. He arrived punctually every afternoon, bringing gifts that revealed genuine attention to her interests. A first edition of Mary Wollstonecraft, books on progressive educational theories, even a generous donation to St. Mary's Orphanage in her name. They conversed for hours in the Hartleys' drawing room, Lady Margaret strategically positioned with her embroidery, finally silent upon realizing that interfering only irritated her daughter. However, it was the stolen moments, The meaningful glances exchanged when no one was watching, the whispered conversations during walks through Kensington Gardens under discreet supervision that made Abigail's heart beat dangerously fast. Daniel had a way of making her feel seen, truly understood, which was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. On Thursday, he suggested a visit to St. Mary's Orphanage, expressing a desire to see the work she held so dear. The suggestion caught Abigail off guard. "It's not exactly a suitable environment for a gentleman of your standing," she warned, as the carriage made its way across London towards Whitechapel, Lady Margaret having declined the invitation with a visible shudder of disapproval. "My standing," Daniel replied dryly, "includes the ownership of mines where men work in conditions that would make most of the aristocracy faint with horror. I believe I can endure an orphanage." The neighbourhood gradually deteriorated as they progressed, the wide, clean streets of Mayfair giving way to narrow alleys where barefoot children played among puddles of dubious water. Abigail watched Daniel discreetly, searching for signs of revulsion or disdain, but he merely studied everything with silent attention. St. Mary's Orphanage occupied a building of worn bricks, yet maintained with evident care. Sister Catherine, the directress, greeted them at the entrance, her eyes widening as she recognized Daniel Whitmore. "Miss Hartley, what an honor! And Mr. Whitmore, of course. Your recent donation was extraordinarily generous." "The credit belongs to Miss Hartley," Daniel responded. "I merely followed her example." Sister Catherine led them through the modest but impeccably clean facilities. Children of various ages occupied different rooms, the youngest supervised by volunteers as they learned basic letters, the older ones already progressing in reading and arithmetic. Abigail noted with satisfaction that the additional resources had allowed for the purchase of more books and writing materials. "Abby!" A girl of about 7 with dishevelled red hair ran down the corridor, throwing herself into Abigail's arms without ceremony. "You're back." "Of course I'm back, Lily." Abigail hugged the child, feeling the familiar tug at her heart that always accompanied her visits. These children had so little, yet offered affection with such generosity. Lily studied Daniel with unblushing curiosity. "Who is he?" "Your husband." "Lily." Sister Catherine reprimanded gently, but Abigail felt a blush creep up her neck. "Not yet," Daniel replied with absolute seriousness, and Abigail nearly stumbled over her own feet. "But I'm working on it." The reply drew laughter from the volunteers present and made Lily clap her hands with childish glee. Abigail recovered her composure with effort, shooting Daniel a look that he returned with exaggerated innocence. They spent the rest of the afternoon among the children. Daniel proved surprisingly natural with them, crouching down to talk at eye level, listening to stories with genuine attention, even improvising a geography lesson when a boy asked about distant countries. Abigail watched, fascinated, seeing yet another facet of that complex man who continued to surprise her. "You are different here," Daniel commented when they finally returned to the carriage, Lily and several other children waving vigorously from the doorway. "Lighter, as if you can finally breathe." "It's the only place where I can be completely myself, without judgment, without impossible expectations." Abigail smoothed her skirts as she settled into her seat. "These children don't care if I'm an unsuitable spinster. They just want someone to care for them. You care deeply. It's evident in the way they speak your name, how Lily ran into your arms." He paused, his fingers lightly drumming on the cane he carried. "Have you considered that you could do even more with adequate resources?" "Constantly, but my own finances are limited, and convincing other members of the aristocracy to invest in education for Whitechapel orphans is—" She searched for the appropriate word. "Impossible." "Practically." Daniel turned to her, his intense amber eyes in the carriage's dimness. "What if it wasn't just your resources? What if there was someone willing to invest substantially in this work, to expand the orphanage, perhaps establish additional schools in other neighborhoods?" Abigail's heart raced dangerously. "Daniel, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting a partnership. You have the knowledge, the dedication, the vision of what these institutions need. I have the financial means and the connections to make it a reality on a much larger scale." He leaned slightly forward. "Together we could make a genuine difference." The word together echoed in Abigail's mind, laden with meaning that went far beyond philanthropy. It was a proposal for a shared future, a vision of companionship that transcended mere matrimonial conventions. That would be extraordinary. Her voice came out almost a whisper. But people would talk. They'd say it's improper, that a woman shouldn't involve herself so directly with the administration of institutions. Let them talk. Don't they already? His smile was simultaneously defiant and conspiratorial. Abigail, I have spent years observing how society wastes female talent, forcing brilliant women to squander their lives on frivolities. When I could have a true partner, someone with whom to build something meaningful, why would I settle for a silent ornament? The carriage stopped before the Hartley residence, before Abigail could formulate an adequate response. Daniel alighted first, offering his hand to assist her, and when their fingers touched, even through their gloves, the familiar electric current coursed through her arm. "Think about what I've said," he murmured, too low for the coachman to hear. "But know that my offer is not conditional on anything other than your willingness. If you decide you do not wish for my company, I will still invest in the orphanage. Your work deserves support regardless of any other consideration." The words should have reassured her, proved that he wasn't manipulating her with promises of resources. Instead, they made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. No one had ever offered unconditional support for her projects. No one had recognized the value of that work, beyond superficial charity. "You are an extraordinary man, Daniel Whitmore," she said, allowing herself to use his given name without the formal Mr. for the first time. "I've merely found someone who inspires me to be better than I would be alone." That night, Abigail sat at the desk in her room, trying to process the day's events. The full moon cast a silvery light through the curtains, illuminating paper and ink. Her hands moved almost on their own, beginning to sketch out plans. How many additional children they could accommodate with more space, what curriculum to implement, how to train teachers properly. Hours later, surrounded by pages covered in notes, Abigail finally admitted to herself what she had been avoiding recognizing. She was falling in love with Daniel Whitmore, not for his elegant courtship or generous gifts, but for the man who crouched to speak with orphans, who read her articles and recognized value in her ideas, who proposed genuine partnership instead of mere matrimonial possession. It was terrifying. To allow herself hope again after years of accepting that this kind of connection didn't exist for her. But perhaps a stubborn voice whispered in her mind, perhaps this time it would be different. Perhaps Daniel truly saw her as he claimed, saw beyond the unsuitable spinster to the woman she truly was. A sigh escaped her lips as she finally extinguished the candle, allowing herself to slide beneath the covers. Tomorrow he would come again, and she would have an answer to his proposal of partnership. But for now, she allowed herself only to feel that dangerous and wonderful hope that bloomed in her chest, stubborn as wildflowers among stones. Abigail's answer to Daniel's proposal came not through words, but through action. The next morning, she met him in his study, presenting detailed plans for the expansion of St. Mary's Orphanage and the establishment of 2 additional schools in underserved areas of London. Her eyes shone with enthusiasm as she spread blueprints and budgets across the mahogany table, explaining every detail with a passion that made Daniel's chest tighten. "Here," she pointed to an architectural plan, "we could add a new wing with proper dormitories. The children currently sleep in overcrowded spaces, which facilitates the spread of illness. And this area would be dedicated to a proper library, not just a few books piled in corners." Daniel studied not only the plans, but the woman who presented them with such conviction. There was color in her cheeks, animation in every gesture, and he realized that this was Abigail in her truest form, without the layers of protection she usually kept raised against society's judgment. "And what about teachers?" he asked, leaning across the table. "Will we have enough qualified personnel? I've been contacting women who would make excellent educators, but lack opportunities, educated widows who need income, young ladies from respectable families without a dowry for marriage, even some governesses who dream of doing more than just teaching etiquette." Abigail met his gaze. "There's so much wasted talent, Daniel. So many people, yearning for purpose. Then we shall give them that opportunity. He placed his hand over hers, his fingers brushing lightly. When do we begin? The smile that lit Abigail's face was genuine and dazzling, without reserve or self-consciousness. In that moment, Daniel knew with absolute certainty that he wished to spend the rest of his life provoking that smile, building dreams alongside that extraordinary woman. But London society had other ideas about the very public courtship between the most coveted bachelor and the spinster Hartley. Tea salons buzzed with venomous speculation. Social newspapers published malicious insinuations disguised as neutral observations. Lady Drummond, in particular, seemed to have made it her personal mission to sow doubts about Daniel's intentions. "It's obvious," she declared during a tea at the Duke of Somerset's residence, her voice carrying across the elegant drawing-room, "that Mr. Whitmore is simply bored. A man of his standing courting a woman nearing 30? Please, when he tires of this philanthropic fancy, he will return to the suitable young ladies of our society." The words reached Abigail's ears through Eleanor, who relayed them with reluctance during a visit. Sitting in the Hartley residence's winter garden, surrounded by potted ferns and orchids, the sisters shared a rare moment of genuine intimacy. "I shouldn't tell you," Eleanor admitted, her hands clasped nervously in her lap, "but I thought you'd prefer to know what they are saying." Abigail kept her expression carefully neutral, though each word was a sharp blade against her already scarred heart. "I appreciate your honesty. You don't give credence to such venom, do you?" Eleanor leaned forward, her blue eyes filled with concern. "Anyone with eyes can see that Mr. Whitmore is sincere in his feelings. The way he watches you, how he smiles when you speak of your projects." "Eleanor, you are kind. But you know as well as I do that Lady Drummond merely expresses what many think. I am unsuitable for Daniel in every measurable sense by society." "Perhaps it is society that is unsuitable, then." Her younger sister's vehement declaration surprised Abigail. Eleanor had always been the more conformist, the one who followed the rules without question. "I've watched you these past weeks, Abby. You are more alive than I've seen you in years, and he sees you, he truly sees you. Shouldn't that be more important than the opinions of bitter people?" Tears stung Abigail's eyes. "When did you become so wise?" "I learned by watching my elder sister be braver than I ever could be." Eleanor took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Don't let them destroy this. You deserve happiness as much as anyone." The conversation still echoed in Abigail's mind when Daniel arrived that afternoon for their usual stroll. He immediately noticed something amiss in the way she avoided his gaze, in the unusual silence as they walked through Regent's Park Gardens under the watchful eye of the lady's companion who followed at a respectful distance. "Something troubles you," he said finally, stopping near a lake where swans glided gracefully over the mirrored surface. "Please trust me enough to share." Abigail watched the water, words caught in her throat. How to explain the fears that haunted her, the growing certainty that this was too good to be true, that eventually he would realize his mistake and leave her with a heart even more broken than before. "They say you are simply bored," she finally forced out, "that when the novelty wears off, when your curiosity about the eccentric spinster is exhausted, you will return to the appropriate young ladies of society." Daniel remained silent for so long that Abigail began to fear she had confirmed her worst suspicions. Then he turned to her, and the intensity in his amber eyes made her lose her breath. "Look at me, Abigail." He took her hands, completely ignoring the impropriety of the gesture in public. "I have spent 32 years observing the ridiculous theatre they call society. I have seen men marry for convenience, treating wives as decorative property. I have seen brilliant women languish in gilded drawing rooms, their talents wasted on empty conversation. I swore that if I ever married, it would be to someone real, someone who challenged my mind, inspired my heart, and shared my vision of making a difference in this imperfect world." He released one hand to gently touch her face, his thumb brushing her cheek with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. "You are everything I sought and did not expect to find. I am not bored, Abigail. I am fascinated, inspired, completely captivated by every aspect of who you are. And if society cannot see your worth, then it is society that is blind, not I." "Daniel!" Her voice broke, tears finally overflowing. "Let them talk," he continued with fervor. Their opinions mean nothing compared to what I feel when I am with you. When we discuss philosophy late into the night, when I see you kneel to embrace an orphaned child, when your eyes glow explaining your plans to change the world, one step at a time. This is real, Abigail, you are real, and it is exactly what I desire for the rest of my life. The lady's companion coughed discreetly, reminding them they were being observed. Daniel retreated reluctantly, but his eyes remained fixed on hers, laden with unspoken promises. "There is something else you should know," Abigail said, wiping her tears with the back of her gloved hand. "If we continue this courtship, the opposition will only intensify. Lady Drummond is not the only one who disapproves. There will be scandal, gossip, perhaps even attempts to steer you away from me through other means. Then we shall face it together." The simplicity of his reply, the unwavering certainty in his voice, warmed something deep within Abigail's chest. "Do you truly believe that a few spiteful matrons and their venomous tongues intimidate me?" An unexpected laugh escaped her, still wet with tears. "When you put it that way, it does seem less daunting." "Because it is less daunting. They are merely words, Abigail. They cannot touch us unless we allow them to." He offered his arm, resuming their stroll with restored propriety. "Now, tell me more about the curriculum you've planned for the schools. Were you mentioning something about including practical sciences beyond basic literacy?" And so, as easily as that, the conversation slid back to safer territory, but something fundamental had changed. Abigail felt the last defenses around her heart begin to crumble, allowing herself to finally believe that perhaps, just perhaps, this extraordinary man truly wanted her, exactly as she was. That evening during dinner with her family, Lady Margaret announced that she had been invited to a ball at the Ashford residence the following week, a celebration for the newlyweds, Charlotte and Lord Edmund. "Naturally, Abigail, Mr. Whitmore was specifically included in the invitation," her mother said with ill-disguised satisfaction. "It seems your sister wishes to publicly demonstrate her support for this courtship." Charlotte's generosity touched Abigail deeply. Her younger sister, so recently married, taking the time to ensure she felt included and supported. Perhaps the family, at least part of it, was finally beginning to see her as more than just a disappointment. "It will be a perfect opportunity," Lady Margaret continued, her eyes gleaming with speculation, "for Mr. Whitmore to make a public declaration of his intentions. If he truly intends to propose to her, a formal ball would be the appropriate setting." Abigail's fork stopped midway to her mouth. Marriage. The word had been uttered so naturally, as if it were an inevitable conclusion. And perhaps it was, she realized with a jolt. Daniel was not a man to court without serious purpose. Every gesture, every word, every shared moment pointed in that direction. The question remained, was she prepared to take that leap? To trust completely, knowing that the fall could destroy her if she were mistaken? But watching Eleanor smile at her encouragingly from across the table, remembering Daniel's words in the park, Abigail felt the answer crystallize in her heart. Yes. 1,000 times. Yes. Even with the fear, even with the uncertainties, even risking everything. Because some opportunities came only once in a lifetime, and refusing them out of fear was a greater tragedy than any possible future disappointment. The ball at the Ashford estate promised to be the most talked-about social event of the season. In the days preceding it, London buzzed with speculation about what Daniel Whitmore might publicly announce regarding his courtship of Abigail Hartley. Wagers ran discreetly in gentlemen's clubs, while ladies gathered in tea salons to dissect every known detail of the improbable romance. Abigail tried to ignore the commotion, focusing on the final preparations for the expansion of St. Mary's Orphanage. But even there, surrounded by blueprints and budgets, her mind insisted on wandering to that night approaching like an inevitable storm. Daniel had visited her daily throughout the week, maintaining social conventions while finding moments to whisper words that made her heart race inconveniently. "Trust me," he had said the previous afternoon, his fingers briefly brushing hers as they examined documents about teacher recruitment. "Regardless of what happens tomorrow night, I will be by your side." The declaration should have reassured her, But Abigail knew the cruelty of high society too well not to feel apprehension. There was something in the air, a tension that went beyond the usual anticipation of a ball. Eleanor had confirmed her suspicions during a morning visit, her face uncommonly troubled. "Abby, I need to tell you something." Her sister closed the bedroom door behind her, ensuring privacy. "I overheard Lady Drummond and Lady Somerset talking yesterday. They're planning something for the ball." Abigail's stomach tightened. What kind of something? "I couldn't hear details, but they mentioned introducing Mr. Whitmore to Lady Victoria Ashbourne, the niece of the Marquis of Winchester. She has just arrived from Paris, apparently a dazzling beauty and impeccably educated." Eleanor took her sister's hands with urgency. "They want to make him question his choice, to show him what he's sacrificing by courting you." Abigail forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears. "So they intend to parade a perfect young woman before him, hoping he'll abandon me for a more suitable option? How original a strategy." "Don't treat this lightly. I saw Lady Victoria briefly. She is impressive, and if Daniel starts to doubt, then he is not the man I believed him to be." The words came out firmer than Abigail felt. "Eleanor, I appreciate the warning, but if Daniel Whitmore can be so easily swayed, it is better to discover it now than after I have linked my life to his." But when her sister left, Abigail allowed herself to sink into the chair near the window, watching the busy street below. The familiar fear coiled in her chest like a serpent, whispering all the insecurities she had spent years trying to silence. Perhaps Lady Drummond was right. Perhaps Daniel would finally realize the absurdity of choosing a 28-year-old spinster when he could have any beautiful young woman from the aristocracy. The night of the ball arrived shrouded in typical March mist, lending the illuminated gardens of the Ashford estate an ethereal and unreal quality. Abigail stepped down from the carriage beside her mother, her amethyst-colored satin gown rustling softly. Martha had outdone herself with the preparations, arranging her brown hair in an elaborate coiffure intertwined with discreet pearls. Not that it would make a difference, Abigail thought bitterly. No amount of fine silk or jewels could transform her into the radiant young woman they expected Daniel to choose. The ballroom was magnificent, illuminated by dozens of crystal chandeliers that cast prisms of light upon the elegantly dressed guests. Charlotte greeted them with genuine enthusiasm, kissing Abigail's cheek with affection. "I'm so glad you came," her younger sister whispered. "And don't worry about the gossip. Edmund and I have made it clear that we completely support your courtship with Mr. Whitmore." Her sister's loyalty warmed Abigail's heart, but it did not entirely dissipate the anxiety clutching her chest. She searched for Daniel among the familiar faces, finally locating him near the French doors leading to the terrace. Even across the crowded room, his eyes met hers with magnetic precision, and the smile that lit his face was so genuine that Abigail felt a part of her tension dissolve. Daniel began to cross the ballroom in her direction, but was intercepted by Lady Drummond and a young woman who could only be Lady Victoria Ashbourne. Eleanor had not exaggerated. The young lady was stunning, with hair the color of pale gold arranged in immaculate curls, large blue eyes, and a figure that made her ivory silk gown seem a work of art. She smiled at Daniel with practiced confidence, her posture exuding the grace of one trained from birth to captivate. Abigail watched the scene unfold like a spectator at a play. Lady Drummond formally introduced them, Lady Victoria making a curtsy that displayed perfect balance and rehearsed elegance. Daniel maintained appropriate courtesy, but his eyes kept drifting to where Abigail stood, and there was something in his expression that made her breathe more easily. "Pathetic, isn't it?" The voice of Lady Beatrice Drummond, Lady Drummond's daughter, cut into Abigail's thoughts. "Trying to compete with someone like Victoria. The poor dear should save herself the humiliation." Abigail turned to face the young woman, who was watching her with ill-concealed disdain. Lady Beatrice had always been particularly cruel, hiding venom behind sweet smiles. "Lady Beatrice, I had not noticed your presence, though given your propensity for unkind remarks, perhaps I should have paid more attention." The direct retort made the young woman blink in surprise. Abigail rarely retaliated publicly, preferring to ignore insults. But something had changed in recent weeks. Daniel had awakened not only hope, but also a quiet fury against those who judged her worth based on such superficial criteria. "How dare you?" Lady Beatrice began, but was interrupted by the arrival of Daniel, who appeared at Abigail's side as if materializing from thin air. "Miss Hartley?" He bowed formally, but his eyes gleamed with intimate warmth. "You promised me the first dance." "Indeed, Mr. Whitmore." Abigail placed her hand on his extended arm, feeling the solidity of his muscles through the fabric of his dark blue coat. As he led her towards the center of the ballroom, Daniel murmured low enough for only her to hear, "Lady Drummond tried to keep me in conversation about the charming Lady Victoria for 10 interminable minutes. Apparently she speaks 4 languages, plays the harp divinely, and embroiders like an angel." "Impressive," Abigail replied, maintaining a neutral tone despite the clench in her stomach. "Utterly tedious." Daniel's correction was immediate and firm. She smiled gracefully throughout the introduction, agreed with everything that was said, and did not express a single opinion of her own. I grew exhausted, merely imagining a life of such empty conversation. The orchestra began a waltz, and Daniel guided her through the first steps with familiar skill that made Abigail feel lighter than air. Around them, other couples joined the dance, but she barely noticed them, conscious only of the man holding her, the warmth of his hand against her back, the way he watched her as if she were the only person in the room. "You are nervous," he observed, guiding her through a pirouette. "I can feel the tension in your shoulders. Eleanor warned me about the plan, to introduce you to Lady Victoria, to make you question—" She trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. "Make me question my choice to court you." Daniel pulled her imperceptibly closer, testing the limits of propriety. "Abigail, look at me." She raised her eyes, meeting that amber gaze that had become as familiar and necessary as breathing. "They could parade 100 Lady Victorias before me, all of them perfectly suitable by society's ridiculous standards. It would make no difference whatsoever, because none of them are you." His voice dropped until it was almost a whisper. "None of them challenge me intellectually, inspire me to be better, make me laugh with sharp observations about the hypocrisies of our class. None of them possess your compassionate heart, or your courage to defend convictions against everyone's opposition." Daniel. The name came out tremulous, laden with emotion she no longer tried to hide. "When this dance ends, I'm going to do something that will likely cause a scandal." There was determination on his face, a decision made that made Abigail's heart quicken. "Are you prepared to trust me?" Before she could answer, the music came to an end. Daniel led her back to the edge of the ballroom, but instead of releasing her, he kept her hand firmly in his. Then, to the absolute shock of everyone present, he guided her to the small dais where the orchestra was positioned and gestured for silence. The murmur of conversations gradually ceased. Heads turned. The entire ballroom focused its attention on London's most coveted bachelor, who stood beside the spinster Hartley, holding her hand in a way that left no doubt about his intentions. "I apologize for the interruption," Daniel began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "But there is something I wish to announce publicly, so that no unnecessary doubts or speculations remain." Abigail felt panic rise in her throat. He wouldn't do this. Not here, before everyone, turning what should be a private moment into a public spectacle. But Daniel squeezed her hand gently, and when she looked at his face, she saw only quiet certainty. "In recent weeks, I have had the privilege of coming to know Miss Abigail Hartley, an extraordinary woman whose worth is measured not by age or conformity to arbitrary social expectations, but by the strength of her character, the brilliance of her mind, and the generosity of her heart." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the shocked faces around them before returning to Abigail. "I have heard the whispers naturally, the speculations about my motivations, the suggestions that this is a mere whim that will soon pass. So allow me to be absolutely clear." Daniel turned fully to Abigail, taking both her hands in his, and in that moment, everyone else disappeared. There was only the two of them, and the promise in his eyes that made tears sting in hers. "Abigail Jane Hartley, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Your compassion for the less fortunate, your dedication to making a real difference in the world, your refusal to pretend to be less than you are just to please a society that doesn't deserve your conformity, All of it completely captivates me. I don't want you despite these qualities, but precisely because of them." He released one of her hands, only to reach into the inner pocket of his tailcoat, producing a small velvet box. Murmurs rippled through the ballroom, but Daniel ignored them completely. "So I ask, before all gathered here, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of building a life by my side, not as a silent ornament, but as a true partner in every sense? Of changing the world with me, one child, one school, one open mind at a time?" The silence that followed was absolute. Abigail was aware of dozens of eyes fixed on her, of her mother's bated breath somewhere in the crowd, of the shock etched on every face. But none of it mattered. Only Daniel mattered, and the question that hung between them like something precious and fragile. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible. Then, louder, allowing everyone to hear, "Yes, Daniel, 1,000 times yes." The smile that illuminated his face was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. He slid the ring onto her finger, an amethyst surrounded by small diamonds that caught the light of the chandeliers, and then, before all of scandalized London aristocracy, he pulled her into an embrace that transcended all bounds of propriety. The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs, but also in applause. Charlotte and Eleanor rushed to embrace her, both crying with joy. Even Lady Margaret seemed too stunned to criticize the impropriety of the scene, and Lady Drummond watched with the expression of someone who had bitten into something exceedingly bitter, Lady Victoria forgotten beside her, but Abigail barely registered anything beyond Daniel. His arms around her, his heart beating against hers, and the absolute certainty that she had finally, impossibly and wonderfully found where she belonged. The wedding morning dawned radiant, defying Lady Drummond's pessimistic predictions, who had even remarked that it would surely rain on the ceremony of such an unsuitable union. Abigail awoke at the Hartley estate with a sense of unreality, as if the past 2 months had been an elaborate dream from which she feared waking. But the amethyst ring on her finger proved the impossible reality. In a few hours she would become Daniel Whitmore's wife. "You need to eat something," Eleanor insisted, entering the room with a tray of tea and toast. "You can't faint at the altar." Abigail sat on the bed, accepting the teacup with hands that trembled slightly. Her sister seemed more nervous than the bride herself, obsessively adjusting pillows and repeatedly checking that the wedding dress was impeccably hung. "I'm perfectly fine, Eleanor. It's you who needs to breathe." "How can I breathe when my older sister, whom everyone considered destined for perpetual spinsterhood, is about to marry the most coveted man in England?" Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes shining with sudden tears. "Abby, I'm so happy for you. So incredibly happy." The sisters embraced, and Abigail allowed herself to feel profound gratitude for having at least part of her family genuinely celebrating her union. Charlotte had sent an effusive letter from the Ashford estate, regretting her inability to attend due to a temporary indisposition, but sending warm blessings. Even Lady Margaret had shown sticky approval, clearly pleased with the social assent the marriage represented, yet unable to express authentic maternal affection. The following hours passed in feverish preparations. Martha supervised the fragrant bath with rose and jasmine essences, then began the elaborate process of dressing the bride. The dress Daniel had commissioned was a work of art, ivory-colored silk with delicate silver thread embroidery that caught the light like morning dew. The modest neckline molded perfectly, the fitted waist gave way to a skirt that flowed in soft layers of fabric. A Belgian lace veil, a gift from Eleanor, completed the ensemble. "Miss, you are absolutely stunning," declared Martha, stepping back to admire her work. Abigail's hair had been arranged in elegant curls intertwined with tiny pearls, a few loose strands softly framing her face. Abigail observed her reflection, trying to see what Daniel saw when he looked at her. She didn't find the classic beauty of her sisters, but there was something different in her eyes, a luminosity that hadn't been there months ago. Happiness, she recognized with a squeeze in her chest. For the first time in years, she had allowed herself to be genuinely happy. The ceremony was held in the private chapel of the Whitmore estate in Surrey, far from the curious gaze of London society. Daniel had insisted on keeping the event intimate, inviting only close family and true friends. Still, as Abigail's carriage passed through the estate gates, she spotted dozens of carriages already parked, evidence that high society would not miss an opportunity to witness that scandalous union. The Whitmore estate proved magnificent, yet with a less ostentatious elegance than other aristocratic mansions. Formal gardens surrounded the main house, built of honey-coloured stone that gleamed under the sun. The chapel stood separately, a small Gothic structure covered in ancient ivy, its stained glass windows casting colourful patterns onto the stone path. Lady Margaret adjusted Abigail's veil with slightly trembling hands, a rare display of emotion from her mother. "Conduct yourself with dignity," she ordered, but her voice lacked its usual harshness. "And be happy, Abigail, despite everything." The imperfect words, the closest to a maternal blessing Abigail would receive, warmed something in her chest. Then Eleanor appeared beside her, taking her arm as the chapel doors opened. The interior was transformed into a fairy tale, white lilies and pearl-coloured roses decorating every surface. Countless candles created a golden ethereal atmosphere. Guests turned to watch her, and Abigail recognized familiar faces. Lord and Lady Ashford supporting Charlotte, who had apparently recovered sufficiently to attend. The Viscount of Pemberton beside Eleanor, even some surprising faces like Lady Drummond, clearly present more out of malicious curiosity than goodwill. But everything faded when her eyes met Daniel's at the foot of the altar. He wore an impeccably cut black tailcoat over a silver brocade waistcoat, but it was his expression that stole Abigail's breath. Absolute admiration, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever beheld. When their gazes met through the veil, he smiled with such tenderness that tears stung her eyes. Eleanor led her down the aisle as the organ played a traditional melody. Each step felt simultaneously eternal and instantaneous. When they finally reached the altar, Daniel extended his hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a silent promise. "Beloved," the Reverend began, his voice echoing through the chapel, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and before this congregation to unite this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words flowed around Abigail like distant music. She was intensely aware of Daniel by her side, of the warmth of his hand, of the way he looked at her as if no one else were present. When the time came for the vows, their voices rang out clear and steady, without hesitation. "I, Daniel Alexander Whitmore, take thee, Abigail Jane Hartley, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. I, Abigail Jane Hartley, take thee, Daniel Alexander Whitmore, to be my lawfully wedded husband." The words came out laden with emotion that she no longer tried to hide. This man, who had appeared in her life like an unexpected storm, transforming everything she believed about herself. This man who saw her, truly saw her, beyond all the accumulated layers of protection and disappointment. Daniel slid the wedding ring onto her finger with surprisingly steady hands, and when it was her turn, Abigail noticed the slight tremor in his fingers as she placed the ring on his. So confident in every other aspect, but in that moment so human as vulnerable as she. "By the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no one separate." The Reverend paused significantly, then added with a gentle smile, "You may kiss your wife." Daniel lifted her veil with reverent care, revealing Abigail's face. For an infinite moment, they simply gazed at each other, committing that instant to memory, an instant that would divide their lives into before and after. Then he leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that began softly but deepened with the promise of everything to come. The chapel erupted in applause, but Abigail barely registered it. There was only Daniel, the taste of his mouth, the way his arms enveloped her, as if he never intended to let her go. When they finally separated, both were breathless and smiling like fools. The banquet followed in the main mansion, a surprisingly joyful event despite Abigail's initial reservations. Daniel did not leave her side for a moment, keeping her close as they received felicitations. Even Lady Drummond managed to produce courteous words, though her smile did not reach her eyes. It was during dinner, while guests savoured elaborate dishes and champagne flowed freely, that Daniel called for attention for a toast. He rose, pulling Abigail with him, his hand firm against her back. "I'd like to thank everyone for sharing this day with us," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "But most of all, I wish to say something to my wife." He turned to Abigail, and there was such intensity in his amber eyes that she felt her heart quicken. "For years, I've watched our society squander the talents of extraordinary women, forcing them into narrow molds that suffocate everything that makes them special. When I met you, Abigail, I saw someone who refused that fate, someone courageous enough to be authentic, even when everyone insisted you should be something else." He took both her hands in his, completely ignoring the captivated audience. "You told me once that you were considered unsuitable, but the truth is you are too extraordinary for the mediocre standards they tried to impose on you. Your compassion, your intelligence, your refusal to accept injustice, all of it inspires me to be better. I am the most fortunate man in this room, not because I married an heiress of great beauty or fortune, but because I found a true partner, someone who will challenge my ideas, support my dreams, and build with me a life of real purpose." Tears streamed freely down Abigail's face now, and she didn't care who witnessed it. Daniel wiped them gently with his thumb, smiling with that tenderness that completely disarmed her. "Beauty fades," he continued, echoing the words he had spoken months ago. "Youth is temporary. Fortune can be lost. But character, intelligence, and genuine kindness, those qualities only grow stronger with time, and I will have the privilege of watching those qualities blossom in you for the next 50 years, if God allows." He raised his glass, and all present followed suit. "To my extraordinary wife, who taught me that true worth lies not in conformity, but in the courage to be authentic. To Mrs. Whitmore," some echoed voices around the room, some more sincere than others. But Abigail noticed nothing beyond Daniel, her husband, companion, partner in every sense. When their lips met again, sealing promises spoken and unspoken, she knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found where she belonged, not despite who she was, but precisely because of it. The night unfolded in a celebration that lasted until the early hours of dawn. When the last guests finally departed, Daniel led Abigail through the torch-lit gardens to the private residence that would be theirs, separate from the main house. There, away from curious glances and social expectations, he embraced her again, breathing against her hair. "Happy, Mrs. Whitmore." "Impossibly and perfectly happy," she whispered back, "and ready to change the world with you, one day at a time." The next morning, letters arrived from all over London. One in particular caught Abigail's attention, a report from Sister Catherine about a new anonymous donation to the orphanage, enough to double its capacity. Attached was a note in unknown feminine handwriting. "Some of us recognize courage when we see it. May your example inspire others to refuse the narrow molds imposed upon us." Abigail smiled, folding the letter carefully. Perhaps her story, so improbable and scandalous, could truly make a difference. Perhaps other women would see that there was value in authenticity, that society's standards did not define their worth. Daniel watched her from the study doorway, recognizing that determined gleam in her eyes. Planning to revolutionize society before breakfast? Naturally, it wouldn't be proper to begin our marriage with modest ambitions. She extended her hand, and he crossed the room to take it, pulling her against his chest. "Then let's begin, together as we promised." And so they did, building a life that defied conventions and changed hearts, proving that sometimes the most improbable stories are exactly what the world needs to hear. The spinster and the millionaire, united not by convenience or conformity, but by a mutual recognition of extraordinary souls refusing to be ordinary.